subscribe. The 1960s started well for the twins. A few months earlier, Reggie had received an 18th-month prison sentence for demanding money with menaces, but there was such a strong suspicion that he had been framed by the police that in March 1960, he was released from Wandsworth pending his appeal. At the same time, Ron was beginning to cope with life and, thanks to his medication, was learning to live with his paranoia. But nonetheless, the advance of his illness was beginning to change not only his appearance but his personality. The twins' passport photos taken at the end of 1959 still show them as virtually identical, but since then, the physical coarsening had set in. Ron had put on weight, his voice had become increasingly expressionless, and something was happening around his eyes. Reggie, in contrast with his brother, was in the best of spirits since leaving prison and was determined to exploit the opportunities of the new decade. For those with their wits about them, there had never been a better time to be a criminal, thanks largely to Parliament, which was still debating what to do about the laws on gambling, some of which went back to the Middle Ages and most of which were unenforceable. So, while the politicians went on arguing and the police gave up arresting people for illicit gambling, so many casinos and gaming clubs were springing up that London was getting known as the gambling capital of Europe. During the late 1950s, the twins had prospered from protecting semi-legal gaming parties in Belgravia hosted by the gambling king of London at the time, John Aspinall. Reggie was missing club life more than ever now and, remembering those parties, he was on the lookout for an upmarket gaming club of his own when someone mentioned Esmeralda's barn. Esmeralda's barn has long since vanished from the ever-changing face of London, its premises demolished and its site in Knightsbridge now occupied by the unlovely bulk of the Berkeley Hotel. But the barn used to be above a row of shops in fashionable Wilton Place, and it was here that it began as a nightclub on London's debutante circuit in the 1950s, with soft lights, sweet music and a resident singer called Cy Grant. Then, as the 1950s ended, a bright young man called Stefan de Fay took the club over and turned it into one of the West End's first legitimate casinos, with a bar, a dining room, roulette, and 3 full-sale tables for Kemi. Soon Alf Mancini, one of London's smartest gambling club managers, joined de Fay as co-director, and it seemed that they could not go wrong. But in the hungry world of early 1960s London, it was unwise to overreach yourself and, although he didn't know it yet, Stefan de Fay was in danger of becoming too successful. It was always said that the Notting Hill property mogul Peter Rachman tipped the twins off about the barn in order to repay a favour. But more important was the fact that Billy Hill, who was rapidly becoming one of London's richest criminals, also encouraged them to go for it. It would be unfair to Billy Hill to ascribe his attitude towards the twins to fellow feeling for a pair of up-and-coming youngsters, still less to kindness or warm-heartedness. Mr. Hill had given up on kindness and warm-heartedness many years before. As for encouraging young talent, after 17 years in Her Majesty's prisons, forget it. The only motive Billy ever had was to do whatever suited Billy Hill. And it suited him to have the Kray twins safely tucked away in Esmeralda's barn to divert them from the richer pickings he was busily exploiting on the gambling scene of Mayfair and Belgravia. Hill had changed a lot since the days of the billiard hall, when the twins had first met him and refused to back him in his fight against Jack Spot. Sensing the new possibilities in London, he had reinvented himself as a big-time criminal tycoon. He had already masterminded the KLM gold job 18 months before, followed by a £250,000 mailbag robbery, and apart from crime, he was now en route to becoming a multimillionaire from the profits of gambling, property, and a large-scale demolition company. He spent part of every year in Morocco, supervising his narcotics business from Tangier to London, and as a one-time burglar, he enjoyed the luxury of his burglar-proof flat in Bayswater, opposite the Greek cathedral. From here he directed his criminal affairs like the chairman of a major multinational, and it was this that made him keen to have the twins on board. For Billy Hill was not naive, and he knew that the richer he became, the more vulnerable he'd be to violence. In London, gang warfare was increasing, but at the age of 49 Billy Hill had had enough of it to last a lifetime. Others could fight his battles for him now. Who better than the Krays? Even with Billy Hill to back them, it was unlikely that the twins could have ever taken over Esmeralda's barn. They would have started by threatening the owner, beaten up a croupier or two, then caused disturbances to interrupt the gambling. Ron was good at creating disturbances, and in the end it might have worked. On the other hand, it might not. Stefan de Fay was no pushover, and he would almost certainly have asked for police protection and toughed it out, all of which would have taken time and scared off the punters, and the twins might well have found themselves back in prison, which was something that they seriously didn't want. To avoid this happening, they turned to one of the finest fraudsters in the country for assistance. Leslie Payne was one of a new breed of high-powered conmen who suddenly appeared in London in the 1960s. The son of an ex-solicitor, he was a big, good-looking, fair-haired man who would have had little difficulty making an honest living had he wished, but who had long ago decided not to. His trademark was a casually tied polka-dot blue bow tie which, when combined with an equally casual lightweight suit, distinguished him from the other shady characters around him. Widely known as Payne the Brain, or the man with the briefcase, he was plausible and so stylishly dishonest that he could be taken for an old Etonian. He was also one of the few people round the twins who had experienced violence on a scale that none of them had ever known, as an infantry sergeant in the war in Italy at the Battle of Cassino. After that, he said, it was hard to take the hangers-on around the twins too seriously. But Payne was never one to underestimate the twins themselves, and he was interested in them for the same reason as Billy Hill was. He wanted the right to use the name of Kray to scare off any other hungry villains who felt like preying on his long-firm frauds. The theory of the long-firm fraud was simple and probably started with the ancient Greeks. It involved buying up large quantities of goods on credit, selling them off for cash as cheaply and as fast as possible, and then disappearing with the money. But there were endless variations on the way it worked, and with his ingenuity and the assistance of his partner, a mouser-looking ex-accountant called Freddie Gore, Leslie Payne had started raking in extraordinary amounts of money. But however smart you were, and Payne and Gore were very smart, there was always the chance of something going wrong. The fall guy you had paid to take the blame might go back on the agreement. Somebody might grass you to the police. Someone might even try to take your operation over. Such things, alas, could happen, and when they did, it was good to have someone on your side with a reputation that everybody feared. Which was why Les Payne had got to know the twins. As he put it, when it came to organized, effective violence, they were quite simply the best in the business. In return, the twins asked Leslie Payne to help them hijack Esmeralda's barn, which he did so skillfully that it was like having teeth extracted by a painless dentist. Stefan de Fay barely knew what had happened to his club until he lost it. Payne began by renting an impressive office just behind the Albert Hall for a few days. Then he rang de Fay out of the blue, inviting him to call one evening at his office to discuss an interesting business proposition. Payne took a lot of trouble with his business propositions, which was why de Fay, who was not a stupid man, accepted. The address was reassuring, and Leslie Payne sounded almost reassuring too. But all this ended when DeFay entered Payne's office and came face to face with the twins. It was not that they said or did anything, threatening or otherwise. They were dressed in their dark blue suits in honor of the occasion, and all they did was sit silently for the next half hour while Payne did all the talking. DeFay was not permitted to say much either, as Payne spelled out certain facts about the ownership of Esmeralda's barn that he had recently discovered. Unlike most conmen's patter, every statement in Leslie Payne's account was true. He started with the barn's monthly earnings. Correct me if I'm wrong, but during the last 3 months your total income from the gambling averaged £7,250 a month. Despite himself, DeFay could only nod. You are also one of 4 principal investors who are drawing money from the club, but final control is vested in a holding company called Hotel Organisation Limited. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that Hotel Organisation Limited is you, and you alone. Once again DeFay nodded. What exactly do you want? He asked. My friends and I wish to purchase Hotel Organisation Limited, and we are offering you £1,000. My lawyer has already drawn up an agreement, and I have it here for you to sign. You and your other 3 directors will keep your places on the board of Esmeralda's barn. You will simply be relieved of all the worries you must have, running such a vulnerable club as this. Worries? But I have no worries, said DeFay. Instead of answering, Payne turned his gaze upon the twins who stared back at Stefan DeFay. I wouldn't be so sure, said Leslie Payne. To be honest, were I in your position I would take the offer while you have the chance. DeFay still tried to argue, but there was something about the presence of the twins that made argument pointless, and he finally did as Leslie Payne suggested. Stefan DeFay was never to set foot in Esmeralda's barn again. What was unusual about Esmeralda's barn was its perfection. Thanks to DeFay and Alf Mancini, it made money like a dream, and there was nothing for the twins to do except enjoy it. With Mancini in charge to supervise the gambling and Payne around to keep an eye on business, the twins had no need to do anything at all. Throughout the 1960s, London's gamblers were going chemi mad. Unlike baccarat, that old favorite of the gambling classes in which the house retained the bank and the profits, in chemi the bank was passed around the players. Hence its full name, chemin de fer, French for railway. Because of this, it was generally believed that chemi was the nearest one could get to a game of pure chance and, at least in theory, the odds were equalized between the players and the house. But this overlooked the fact that in every game the players contributed what was known as the cagnot. This was between 7 and 8% of the money on the table, and it was taken by the house. Since at Esmeralda's barn the twins and Leslie Payne were the house, every penny of the cagnot went to them. So one can understand why Payne advised the twins, whatever the temptation, never to interfere with such a foolproof way of making money. This suited Reggie, who was increasingly busy now with his various protection rackets and the complicated long-firm frauds that he was running in partnership with Payne. In many ways Reggie was not unlike his father, old Charlie Kray, a smart old-fashioned trickster who was keen to get his hands on any racket going. Given the chance, Reggie could be extremely sharp, and he was particularly grateful to Billy Hill, who had finally decided to educate him about the various criminal possibilities emerging in the 1960s. Many years later, in a deathbed interview, Reggie paid Billy Hill the ultimate old lag's tribute by calling him my mentor. But back then Reggie was also learning fast from Leslie Payne, and compared with the money that the twins were making from these other rackets, Esmeralda's barn was something of a sideshow. During the first 6 months of 1960, their joint income, with Leslie Payne from the long-firm frauds alone, topped £50,000, which in those days was a lot of money. The twins took half of this, whereas at Esmeralda's barn their weekly take was rarely more than £800 apiece. But then, it called for little effort. Besides, for Reggie, the fact that he and Ronnie were now owners of the club meant a lot to him. After so many setbacks in the past, he was finally in the sort of West End club he'd dreamed of, and, like many ambitious young East Enders in the 1960s, he felt that he had at last crossed the line between the old East End and the tempting pastures of the Golden West. Soon he was proudly inviting several of the celebrities he'd known at the Double R and the Kentucky to the barn, and was in danger of becoming something of a celebrity himself. He'd already had dark blue dinner jackets made for himself and Ron, and he loved to play host to the barn's rich clientele. On one gala evening, Judy Garland came, while more frequent visitors included the singer Lita Rosa, a new young star called Barbara Windsor, and the blonde bombshell Diana Dawes. Reggie was in his element at last, but Ronnie was different. During those early days at Esmeralda's barn, Ron always seemed to be the odd man out. By completing his prison sentence in Wandsworth Prison, he had done all that the law required of him to prove his sanity. But although Doc Blasker was still trying to stabilize him with pills, this was not the same as being cured, and whatever the law might say about his sanity, there would never be a cure for his condition. In contrast with the young and still handsome Reggie, Ron in his dark blue dinner jacket looked increasingly like Dracula on a bad night out. Sometimes he even scared himself when he glanced in the mirror and saw the thickening features, the extra weight, and something very odd about the eyes. The truth was that he was beginning to look like what he really was, a dangerous paranoid schizophrenic. Throughout all this, one person in the twins' small circle was totally oblivious to what was happening to Ron, his mother, Violet. During the early days at the club, the twins occasionally invited her for dinner, and after such occasions, there was no prouder mother in the whole of Bethnal Green. Vi had always stood loyally by her twins whatever happened, and was thrilled to see them so successful. To please her, Reggie always did his best to be patient with his brother, which wasn't easy. To be fair to Violet, she was always grateful. But there was one thing that she wouldn't tolerate: any suggestion now that Ron was mad. Mad? Her Ronnie? How could anyone say such a thing, after all he'd suffered? Because Violet felt so strongly on the subject, the rest of the family had to follow her example, as did the members of the firm, for whom Ron's mental health became a virtual test of loyalty. There was nothing wrong with Ron that time, and kindness wouldn't cure, said Violet. Reggie dutifully agreed and told himself that the more contact his brother had with ordinary people, the more he'd pull himself together and start to cure himself. Which to a point was true, but only to a point. In fact, the gap between the twins was widening. Reggie was more than ever now the live wire, the close friend of the stars, and the serious earner of the two. Reggie was clearly going places. As for Ronnie, for most of the time he seemed to be living in a daze created by his sickness or his medication. Then suddenly the situation changed, thanks to one of those twisted bits of luck which dominate the lives of criminals. Reggie's appeal against his sentence was unexpectedly rejected, and back he went to Wandsworth Jail. In Reggie's absence, Ron took over Esmeralda's barn. With hindsight, one can see this as a crucial moment in the lives not only of the twins, but also of others in close contact with them. Indeed, it could be argued that the next 6 months with Ron in charge of Esmeralda's barn would see the start of something new and virtually unheard of in the world of crime in 1960s London. To begin with, When he found himself in charge of Esmeralda's barn, Ron acted like a child who finds a magic money box and sets off on a spending spree. In the cashier's office, there could be such large amounts of money that Ron found them irresistible, and he started on a voyage of personal discovery round the rich West End of London. He began in Savile Row by ordering several suits from one of the most expensive tailors in London. In Jermyn Street, he discovered the shirt makers Turnbull and Arthur, and ordered several dozen shirts from them as well. Then, finally, just around the corner from the barn, he found Harrods, not today's glorified shopping mall, but the old Harrods, which still prided itself on getting anything its customers desired. Remembering the success of his donkey at the billiard hall, Ron decided he would buy an elephant from the pet department, saying he wanted it to liven up the barn. When someone told him that an elephant wouldn't go up the stairs, he bought a chimpanzee instead and ordered Turnbull and Arthur to make the primate a dress shirt and a black bow tie. Then he brought his well-dressed chimpanzee to the barn, where he sat him down among what he saw as all the other monkeys trying their luck around the chimney tables. When his monkey won, he insisted that he was paid his winnings. Say what you like about old Ron, but there were times when he really was a joker. With so much money coming in, Ron should have been free from all financial worries. But in fact, it was now his attitude to money that landed him in trouble. Since gambling clubs are legally obliged to pay winnings on the spot, in order to survive, most clubs insist that gamblers also pay their losses straight away, for once stud checks start piling up, it's usually a sign of a gaming club that's on the road to ruin. One of the reasons for Alf Mancini's continuing success was that he never offered credit to even the most favored punters. But here, as usual, Ron was different. Apart from treating Esmeralda's as his private money box, he also started offering friends and fellow criminals endless credit, encouraged them to overspend, and then enjoyed putting the squeeze on anyone with money. During his first month on his own, Ron landed the club with debts of £1,500. By the second month, they had reached £3,500, and by the end of the third month, Mancini had offered Ron £1,000 a week to stay away. When Ron told him to get lost, Mancini understood that the time had come to follow Ron's advice himself. Within a few weeks, he was running another gaming club in Curzon Street. Within a year, he owned the place. Mancini's departure brought an instant dip in the profits at the barn. Most of Mancini's regulars were in the restaurant business and had been coming to Esmeralda's since the club began. They gambled heavily, drank sparingly, and always paid their debts. But when Alf Mancini left, most of them went with him. Ron barely seemed to notice. If the club was getting into debt, so what? He liked to think that people were grateful to him for his generosity, although what he really liked was to put the fear of God into those who couldn't pay. He rarely used violence on them, but he loved tormenting them, and sometimes sent members of the firm to call on them at home. In spite of which, the club began to grow and the membership began to change. So did Ron, who was about to experience something of a personal revelation. In the basement under Esmeralda's, a girl called Jeanette had recently opened a lesbian disco called the Cellar Club, which became a free and easy meeting place for gays of every sexual inclination. As a serious male chauvinist, Ron had always said that he hated lesbians. But Jeanette was an exception, and when he started visiting her club, he discovered something that surprised him. None of its members seemed to feel the slightest sense of shame at being homosexual. Soon in the Cellar Club, he started meeting other gays who, far from disguising their sexuality, obviously enjoyed it. When Ron saw some who even dared to flaunt their nature, he realized that being gay could actually be fun, and he started to enjoy it too. Then, finally, he plucked up courage and decided it was time to emerge from the closet. Ron was far too square ever to be considered camp, and he hated effeminacy in men as much as he hated it in women. He also made it clear exactly what he was. In gay parlance, Ron was a giver, not a taker. "I'm not queer," he used to say. "I'm homosexual." And from then on, as far as he was concerned, in matters sexual, that was that. But for Ron, this change of attitude had one all-important side effect. With the awareness that his sexuality was no longer any cause for personal embarrassment came a rapid increase in self-confidence, and along with gay liberation, much of the sense of class inferiority that had always bothered him began to disappear as well. Interestingly, it was the opening at the Cellar Club in the basement under Esmeralda's barn that helped to bring about a change in the barn's membership, as more playboy gamblers took the place of the restaurateurs and head waiters who had left the club along with Alf Mancini. Some of the newcomers were gay, some weren't, and some were not particularly concerned about what they were. But since this was the swinging 60s, none of this seemed to matter very much at Esmeralda's barn. Certainly Ron felt more at ease among them than he had with Alf Mancini's friends, and for the first time he began to feel at ease in the club that, partially at least, belonged to him. It was now, with Reggie away, that he started to use it rather as he used the old billiard hall in Eric Street. Not only did he make the barn his headquarters, but at times he used it as his personal theater to perform in front of the members, who became a sort of captive audience. It was now, as Aunt Rose used to say, that Ronnie started acting up. By its nature, big-time crime is silent crime, and the criminal tycoons of the 1960s, like Billy Hill, the Addams brothers, and the Richardsons, trod softly and had no desire to advertise their business or themselves. Even the elusive Freddie Foreman, whose criminal empire was beginning to rival Billy Hill's, never courted personal publicity. Characters like these were as much a part of the enterprise culture of the 1960s as any takeover tycoon or merchant banker. Like them, they were primarily concerned with money, and like them they conducted their activities with considerable discretion. Ronnie could not have been more different. The twins patterned themselves on the old-style villains of the past, whose legends they had grown up with. This specially applied to Ronnie, and the more publicity he got, the better. With Ron, it was partly due to the necessity of feeling special, and partly to the dominating influence of his paranoid nature. Driven by its overwhelming mood swings, and depending on his mood, Ron could play many parts. His appearance helped. It was the criminologist Dick Hebdige who first called him an actor criminal. This did not mean that they weren't also real criminals, and didn't do appalling things. Of course, as we have seen already, Reggie, like his mentor Billy Hill, was seriously into making money and was already a successful organizing criminal. He was also in close contact with the American Mafia. But in the early 1960s, as organized crime increased, there was a vacancy for somebody to be the public face of villainy. This showed in the way most fascinating creations of thriller writers like Ian Fleming were their villains. Monsters were suddenly in vogue, but they had no real-life equivalent, and it wasn't what you were, but what people thought you were that mattered. How much was gossip? How much was grim reality didn't really matter very much. What did matter was the growing impression created in the minds of those who came in contact with them that the twins were the most powerful and ruthless criminals in London. It was at Esmeralda's barn that London found the monster it was seeking. First, of course, came Ron's appearance. He really could look very frightening. Indeed, one of his most bankable assets as a real-life villain was that he looked like a murderer several years before he actually murdered anyone. It also helped that he had episodes of real madness and that his moods depended largely on whether Doc Blasker's pills were working. This made him irrational and unpredictable and potentially extremely dangerous, which all added to his legend. With Reggie still away, Ron was at liberty to turn the barn into what he'd always wanted, a richer, more accommodating version of the old billiard hall. Here Kemi could take the place of snooker to provide the necessary background, and for Ron and any friends he invited, food and drink were on the house. When in the right mood, Ron would put on an unforgettable performance with a sudden demonstration of his lethal virtuosity. All the stories being told about the twins concerned violence and the fear of violence. One victim who had taken the liberty of beating up the son of an old friend of the twins, and should obviously have known better, needed to be taught a lesson, which Ron did by taking him into the kitchen when Esmeralda's barn was closed, heating up a steel knife sharpener on the gas and branding him with it on the cheek. It was also true that Ron had disciplined another villain who had unwisely told him that he had put on weight by taking him into the washroom at the club and slashing off half his face. At a club as respectable as Esmeralda's barn, a little violence went a long way. There were also incidents of mayhem and skullduggery at the club that lost nothing in the telling, and other stories that originated in the minds of some of Esmeralda's clientele. I don't believe, for instance, that, as legend had it, Ron imprisoned somebody all night with a hungry Doberman to teach him a lesson. Still less do I believe the story that he anally assaulted an accountant with a red-hot poker. But the best stories were the ones that only Ron himself could have invented, and by the time that Reggie returned from prison late that summer, he could see that Ron had changed. Reggie made light of Mancini's departure, nor did he mention the pile of dishonored checks in the secretary's office. That was Ron all over, and as long as he was happy and Violet was pleased, that was all that mattered. But one thing troubled Reggie. After his absence, not only did the club feel different, with its changing clientele, but no one took much notice of him anymore. It was Ron they wanted, Ron that people talked about, and Ron who seemed to rule the roost. Although this rankled, Reggie had other things to think about while Ron was still enjoying the company of his gay friends in the cellar club downstairs. Reggie kept his sexuality to himself and had openly started courting pretty Frances Shay, the teenage sister of a boy that Ron had once fancied. And while he was in prison, Reggie had started dreaming of life with her in the distant future, with marriage, children, and a settled home life. This would mean, of course, that he would have to break from Ronnie, which he longed for all the more because he knew it was impossible. With his telepathic way of knowing what Reggie was thinking, Ron knew exactly what was going through his mind, but didn't worry. He knew that Reggie could never get away from him. One gets a clear idea of how Ron's power was growing from the painter Francis Bacon, who met the twins together in Morocco early in 1962 when they were in Tangier as guests of Billy Hill. Hill had business interests that he wanted to discuss with them, principally protecting his highly profitable trade in hashish and heroin against the threat of the American mafia in Europe, as well as from the criminal element in Tangier itself. Reggie was interested and promised Hill that he would help, but whenever Ron was in Morocco, he was interested in one thing and one thing alone: the local boys. When he had visited Tangier back in 1959, he'd said that he found them unbelievable. Francis Bacon felt the same, which was why he spent several months in Tangier every year, and while he was there in 1962, his friend, the wild young actor Stanley Baker, who was there on holiday, introduced him to the twins. Baker had got to know Reggie by visiting the Double R, and all four of them went out to dinner at a local restaurant. Once they were sitting down comfortably, Ronnie noticed a boy he knew at a nearby table and called him over. Then, instead of introducing him, he ordered the boy to kneel down and kiss his shoes. Clearly frightened, the boy obeyed. Ron said nothing, took no notice, and the boy scurried off, looking terrified. Ron's behavior made a great impression on Bacon, who was deeply shocked and later told his biographer, Michael Pepiat, that he felt this was a horrible thing to do to anyone. But while Ron's behavior repelled him, it also fascinated him. According to Pepiat, Bacon believed, like many in the 1960s, that East End criminals possessed some ruthlessly virile sense of amorality, and what particularly turned him on was the thought of succumbing to a man like Ron who was beyond good and evil, totally immoral, and would stop at nothing, even murder. Clearly a masochistic homosexual like Francis Bacon offered an extreme example of the psychic force that Ron projected, which makes the reaction of a strictly heterosexual tough guy actor like Stanley Baker to the twins particularly interesting. Even for him, violence came into it, for Baker apparently told Francis Bacon afterwards that he thought it was terribly smart to get to know the twins because of their reputation as the most violent and feared operators in the London underworld, with a number of grisly murders to their credit. What is fascinating about this is that although by 1962 the twins, and Ron in particular, had inflicted every known form of grievous bodily harm on somebody or other, the one crime that he and Reggie would both avoid for nearly 4 more years was murder. In 1962, there was still capital punishment for murder, and like most of their predecessors, the old East End villains, the twins actually had no intention of taking the 9 o'clock walk to the gallows. In spite of this, now that they were fast becoming the legendary twin monsters of the 1960s, the rumors grew that they were killers. Until the end of 1962, most of the tales about the twins came from members or visitors to Esmeralda's barn. Then suddenly all this changed with the arrival on the scene of a keen admirer and self-appointed publicist of the Krays, who began the process of turning them into the monsters who would haunt the imagination of the 1960s. David Litvinov was one of a family of Russian Jewish immigrants who settled in the poorest part of Whitechapel in the 1890s. One of his brothers, Emanuel Litvinov, was a poet, and another, Barnett Litvinov, was the friend and biographer of Ben Gurion. As a child, great things were predicted for the third son, David, who was very bright and had a gift for words. But he also had a wicked streak and became the black sheep of the family. He was homosexual, loved low life, and tried to be a villain. The 1960s found him living with a pretty ex-stable boy called Bobby Buckley in a flat in Ashburn Gardens, off the Gloucester Road in Kensington. By now, rather than do anything as dull as working for his living, Litvinov was involved in the only true career he ever had, as a talker, joker, and teller of elaborate tall stories to some of the most interesting people in Chelsea. Before long, he was at the center of one of the most colorful and influential cliques in swinging London. As well as talking, Litvinov also loved to gamble, but when he tried his luck at Esmeralda's, he was less successful, and he finally confessed to Ron that he owed the club over £3,000. Keen as ever to take advantage of this sort of situation, Ron suggested an agreement that would suit them both. In lieu of payment, Ron accepted the short lease that Litvinov owned on the flat in Kensington, provided that his boyfriend Bobby Buckley was included in the deal. Litvinov could go on living there together with Ron and his former lover, to which Litvinov agreed. So it was that for the next 18 months Ron came to be living at a smart address in fashionable Kensington with Litvinov and Bobby Buckley, and all three of them getting up to God knows what together. It was largely thanks to Litvinov that Esmeralda's barn began to form a bridge between two separate and dynamic worlds in 1960s London, which had already begun to intermingle. The nostalgically resurgent world of East End villainy, of which the twins were becoming the most famous representatives, and the celebrity-conscious showbiz world of swinging Chelsea. Time and place are crucial for most things in life, and one of the many fascinating things about the twins is how they now invaded the imagination of a small but influential group of celebrities, headed by Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones, who lived near to one another in the most desirable parts of Chelsea. These were glamorous people, artistic, rich and highly influential. They were trendsetters who stood emphatically for certain things: youth and freedom from the old taboos of sex and class. At heart, most of them were self-indulgent anarchists, and as pioneers and eager practitioners of the new drug culture, which brought them into unwelcome contact with the law, culminating in the notorious Redlands bust, which ended up with Jagger and several of his friends in prison. They had little sympathy with the law or the police. They were easygoing over sex, on the basis of the more of it the better, and they loved Morocco for the climate and the easy availability of drugs. Those who were jealous of them called them the Chelsea Mafia, but George Melly got nearer to the truth when he called them the Chelsea Popocracy. By the time that Ronnie got to know him, Litvinov had become their unofficial court jester. The group's king across the water was young Paul Getty, who was still clinging on to his position as the favorite son of the reputedly richest and meanest man in the world, the oil billionaire J. Paul Getty. Young Paul had recently bought beautiful Queen's House on Cheney Walk and commuted between there and his house in Tangier. He and his glamorous wife Talitha were often high on drugs themselves. Other Rolling Stones were near neighbors, including Jagger, Brian Jones, and Keith Richards, together with their girlfriends such as Marianne Faithfull and Anita Pallenberg. There was also a rich young bisexual painter called Donald Camomel who wanted to be a film director and rented a room above the Pheasantry Club in Kings Road, Chelsea, to be near his teacher Antigone. According to his brother David, Donald Clamel was utterly fascinated by the Krays and couldn't hear enough about them. So was another all-important member of the Popocracy, the influential young art dealer gay groovy Bob Fraser. Soon, in one way or another, most of the Popocracy was becoming obsessed with Litvinov stories of the twins, and the day would come when Mick Jagger and his Chelsea friends would play an all-important role in adding to their legend. This was the point at which the cult of criminal celebrity from the old East End began to meet the new pop culture of the swinging 60s in earnest. As much as with any of the other iconic figures of the time, the twins were truly children of the 60s. Without gay liberation, changes in the gaming laws, and the abolition of capital punishment, their phenomenal career would not have been a possibility. In addition, there was one other largely unsuspected social change which now proved crucial in their rise to fame and notoriety. This was the breaking down of centuries-old barriers in London between the West and the old East End, where the twins had grown up. This was a process which the historian of the East End, Ian Sinclair, has compared with the coming down of the Berlin Wall, as two-way traffic expanded between the East and West, and London began to reunite itself.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.
Leave a like and subscribe.